right. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Learning Tech Talks where we are exploring. Well, let's see. I've changed this now. I'm living life at the intersection of business technology and the human experience. So you know what? This conversation there will be intersections with technology, but it's bigger than that. And we're going to be talking about the unconscious bias of leadership and leadership development, which is going to be a very fun conversation. And it's actually one of the things I love most about the way I do this, I'm joined by Ben Brooks. He's joining me again from Pilot, and it's going to be a spicy conversation. So take some, I don't know, milk of magnesia if you need to, because it's going to be hot sauce on this one. But I'm looking forward to this. And one of the things I enjoy about the style of show is coming into it, we were backstage going, how do we want to structure this thing? And then the moment hit and we went, this is what it's going to be. And this really started because I did a video on YouTube this week about are leaders born or made? And I won't spoil what I get into in that discussion, but that led to this discussion. So thanks so much, Ben, for joining me again and for the flexibility of going, you know what? We don't got the talking points. We don't got the premeditated questions going. We're just going to flow with it.
Well, it's coming from a place of passion and a place of experience for both of us. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I'm glad that we're getting to talk about something actually in this space that's sort of interesting and often unexplored. So I'm pumped. I got my coconut iced coffee, my Nespresso coconut flavor that they're making for the summer. So I'm ready to go.
You were ready to go. I didn't even have time to go grab my beverage of choice before we went live. So I'll be a little parched by the end, but that's okay. And you have a special guest at your feet as well, keeping you company along the way too.
Yes. And that is, just to be clear, a dog. So don't get your mind going crazy. This is like, this is a little dog named Disco, miniature Eskimo. So he's snoozing away. So nobody's giving me
away. So if Ben all of a sudden has to go on mute, it's because someone rang the doorbell and Disco has thought World War
into attack mode
has started. Yep.
Protecting his uncle. So we're all good. So
I get it. Well, for those who maybe didn't catch our last conversation, just a little bit of background on you, who you are, and what you're doing with Pilot.
So, I'm Ben Brooks. I'm based here in New York City. I am an entrepreneur, founded a company called Pilot with my life savings about 8 years ago with the simple mission. We want everyone will be important in this conversation, everyone to feel powerful at work. And we do that through group coaching, executive fireside chats, self-reflection, and manager future-focused feedback in cohorts of 6-month programs that we deploy at companies like Nestle and Diageo and S&P Global and MetLife around the world. And it's really coming from my background being an HR practitioner. I was a senior vice president of HR, and I've had an executive coaching practice for a decade, and just kind of kept seeing where people were sort of stubbing their toe in their careers and their employee experience, and really the things that affected people's answer to the question at the dinner table, how was work today, honey? The answer to that was often things that employees weren't really taking ownership of or stepping up to do. And so leading their own lives and careers. So that's what Pilot does. And I'm just really passionate to talk all things talent, DEI, learning, etc.
Okay. Well, we're going to get into all of those things. And we had a really good discussion last time as well. So I have no doubt we're going to hit on some of this stuff. But let's kick it off in here, because when you think about leadership, and again, it's a word that's thrown around a lot.
Yep.
I mean, the number of times you be in a conversation and, we need to develop our leaders, or we have a leadership issue in our organization. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So when you think about it, how are you distinguishing between, let's say, role, situation, mindset, skills? I mean, there's a whole lot of things that go into it.
Well, I think, I had a workshop I led a number of years ago, and I had people draw. And I love to have people draw, because you tap into people's subconscious. I said, draw management and draw leadership. Management, people were at a bureau desk and they were filling out paperwork, and had a clipboard and they're yelling at people. And leadership, someone's on a stage and they're giving somebody a hug, and they're courageous. They're going through the jungle. They're a military personnel in a battle. And so I think, our leadership has the sexy brand. Leadership is the premium offering.
It's like what people aspire to.
Yeah. Like it's the Cadillac versus the Chevy, right? It's the, so everyone, like, leadership is the sexy thing we're all told is good, and we buy books about it, and it's interesting. But I really think of, management, the fundamental definition is the achievement of results through others.
Okay.
And we often think, is it leadership or management? I tend to think of leadership is something you build on good management. Because frankly, if you have leadership absent management, like you're not clear about like role clarity or direction or goals or responsibility, a lot of the fundamentals are the building blocks that, management and leadership can play together. But I think we tend to collapse leadership to mean 1,000 things. Someone values or traits or personalities or ways of being or a best practice, and we're all like, this is leadership. I mean, if you were to look at the number of Harvard Business
the number of internet memes or LinkedIn
memes,
posts or whatever on leadership, it's literally, it could mean anything if you were to collect them all together.
And every year there's like a new thing, like leadership in the age of AI, leadership, in a DEI environment, leadership in a recession. And we're always sort of trying to like dimensionalize or find some root to it. But I think that it's this gigantic term that we sort of misunderstand, but it's aspirational. So we all want to link to the brand because the brand is luxury. The brand is the catalog.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times there's a lot of power in associating things with it. Right?
Totally.
You want to get something done. If you can somehow connect it to leadership, somehow it automatically gets more street cred because it's like, okay, well, we should listen to this because it's about leadership. Totally. Where other things don't have that same kind of pull power.
And I think that ultimately, we undervalue management and sometimes overvalue leadership, in my perspective, and in particular, overvalue this vague concept of leadership. I think that leadership, and a more tightly
this esoteric, like idea, nostalgic idea of what we think it is.
This panacea, motherhood and apple pie, rainbow and bunnies sense of leadership, right? That in management, if you were to think of good, manager development training and a manager competency set and things, it's pretty important, right? To set deadlines, to maintain good communication, to help problem solve, to resolve conflicts, to give feedback, to escalate or break down barriers, right? To allocate things effectively, to get, to evaluate, to approve. These are things that are very functional in an organization. There's a
they're very tactical in nature.
Yeah, but they are the kind of the building blocks, right? Pilot, we have one of my colleagues, he's our COO, and he talks about transformation is 90% logistics. And so a lot of the logistics are sort of managerial tactics in nature, but it's clear of like who's doing what. And that is so fundamental. But then there's this leadership piece that we tend to sort of have be this thing that we kind of, well, of course, everyone should have a good manager. And we do all that. And we all know that like very good managers are scarce. Every Fortune 1000 company I've ever spoken to has bitched about their middle management or their frontline supervisors. And for 40 years, consulting firms have written white papers around middle management and frontline supervisors. So we know that management is actually not that consistent or prevalent in organizations. We tend to think, you know what, if we smear some Nutella, some leadership on top of this, it'll all be fine.
Well, so what's interesting is, and I mentioned this backstage, so there's two things I'd respond to on yours. So the one that was, I very much saw some similar things. I was with a group of leaders recently and was talking to them and asked them, what was it like when you worked under someone you would consider a great leader? What was that experience like? How did they embody it? And the things they described were very similar to what you said. They were very empowering. They were empathetic to me. They knew they had a clear vision and were able to bring us along for the ride. They communicated really, like things like that. But when I asked the same group of people, if someone were to come to you and say, hey, things are about to hit the fan, you need to step up and lead right now, what would that look like? And the response looked nothing like what they had just described in terms of what their best great leader. It was power, it was control, it was telling people what to do, it was dragging people through the mud, unwillingly to get them where they needed to go. It was a very different dynamic. And so it is one of these things where I think there is an important part of actually breaking down, what do we actually mean with this? When what you said, the way I look at it in some ways is leadership, I don't even know that that's the right word for it, because it's almost one of these underlying, like what actually makes people distinguishingly good at being human in some ways. It's like what makes people fantastic human beings is when you're really getting into some of these human skills of, well, they're really good at doing this. Going back to your management approach, you apply that by leading a team. So you have these distinguishable capabilities underneath this that just make you a quality human being, make you effective at doing whatever it is you're doing. And then you apply them in different ways. And so when you think about leading a team, it's like, well, I have to take these and I have to now put them through that lens. But to your point, oftentimes we do the opposite. We're like, okay, here's all the stuff everybody's doing. Let's just like, I like that Nutella, a little bit of leadership on the top. And then magically we'll take this nasty, whatever toast, and we'll make it good by putting a little bit of Nutella on the top. And it's like, actually, you're doing it wrong because you're trying to layer on top of something instead of build your foundation on it and then just nuance and apply it in different ways.
And I think I'm curious, you said you were talking to a group of leaders. Like, what made them leaders?
I guess it was one of the things where it's a great call out, because I think that was just the title of the work group it was in. It was right. It's like I don't think there was a consistent set of criteria, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah. Who's in that room or why they're there. And maybe that they were all VPs or they were all at companies of a certain size. So they all had so much experience. They all had a certain certification. And I think that sometimes, one of the things I find that I really get angry about, frankly, is we make leadership this thing that's associated with role or position. Yeah. And we collapse authority with leadership. And yet we think, oh, we can all be leaders, but then we're like, oh, you have to lead a team. You can't, but like people lead.
We say it, right? Well, again, going back to, we say it with our mouths, everyone's a leader.
Yes.
But there's really this categorization.
Role, if you want a leadership role or be in a leadership position or be at the leadership level or be on the leadership team, those are all things.
Or invited to the leadership meeting that I was invited to where this topic came up.
Correct.
Then there's a different set of criteria.
Exactly. And so we sort of, stratify it and confuse it with position or role or authority or rank or status or class, something like that. Yep. And so we've all seen people in C-suite positions who are what I would describe as senior executives, right? Senior managers or senior executive, corporate executives, that we've all can think of examples probably right now of people that are in those roles that you would absolutely say are not leaders, right?
Yeah. 100%. Right? There's plenty of people in roles, in positions that you would go, they are not a leader.
Not a leader, right? And so, and that's a challenge, right? But then yet they're in a leadership position or at the leadership level or in a leadership role, and they tend to stay at that level.
Yeah. They've been awarded the badge, but they have not earned it with the skills.
Correct, right? And then there's also people we can think about who may be a receptionist, a coordinator, a specialist, and assistant, something like that, who absolutely demonstrate leadership skills and behaviors that have no defined authority at a certain level. But you're like, this is a person who gets things done. This is the person people follow.
They may not have formal authority structures, but they're the person that somehow, when they need to get something done, the decisions get made and the road's clear.
And when I was a management consultant, we looked at organizational network analysis, and you're like, oh, well, who really has the influence in the organization? It was often 3, 4, 5 levels from the CEO down, often people in individual contributor roles that were the ones you really needed to go sort of kiss the ring or, bring along or be the champion.
Yeah, because if they weren't on board, and anybody listening, those people in the organization. Totally. They technically, organizationally, it makes no sense. Yet, if they're the person who's the dissenting opinion on what you're trying to do, it ain't happening.
Absolutely. And so in Pilot, we talk about this. We have a coaching series called Management, Leadership, and Power. And we bring all of it together. And we talk about, the 6 or 7 sources of power and how people establish those in organizations and how, the different levels of thinking managerially. But then we talk about the head, heart, and guts model of leadership, right? So your strategic thinking and your analysis and your market knowledge. The heart, right? The interpersonal, the EQ, the motivation, the care, the empathy, right? And the guts, right? You're doing the right thing, your steadiness, your courage, your fortitude, your ethics, right? And
Yep.
bringing all of those sort of things together, and different organizations have different leadership frameworks or models or competency sets, but they kind of generally map to those three categories, more or less, some versions. And sometimes it's not always equal distribution, depending on the industry or their sort of perspective on it. But if you map 10 leadership frameworks, you're going to see a lot of overlap in them. And
I don't know that I've ever looked at a leadership competency model, at least a decent one, and gone, wow, what's on here I've never seen before on any other model before. Or it has something that you just go, really? That's the thing that you picked? Going back to some of these like underlying human elements that it's like, well, that just makes you a good, effective human being on the planet.
And sometimes, organizations will collapse, technical skill or, sort of managerial competencies with some of those leadership ones, right? And it's important to kind of separate those things out. But so we talk at Pilot of like leading from every level. Like people often, we say, the only person that says whether you're a leader or not is yourself. The idea that it is this club that you are anointed in is bullshit.
You're donned with the scepter.
Yes, exactly. From a bunch of knuckleheads Nutellaing things that aren't leaders themselves.
Yeah. Exactly.
But they're going to read a book
who aren't actually leaders themselves.
Yeah, they're going to read a book on a plane or a Harvard Business Review thing or a whatever, right? And tell the organization to do the leadership behavior, but not model it themselves, right?
Yep.
Or they're going to say one thing on the employee value proposition and the careers page or whatever, the company values, but then they'll do a different thing, right? Yep. So I think that one of the things that I struggle with is that from an equity and inclusion perspective, DEI continues despite culture wars and things. It seems to be this enduring, important thing, especially in a country like the United States, where we're arguably one of the most diverse countries in the world. And we are with
a workforce coming into the generation coming into the workforce that is the most diverse generation in the history of
and we're one of the most globally connected countries in the world. So both the inputs of our vendors and supply chain, be physical or digital or knowledge or labor, and the outputs of our customers and clients around the world are also very diverse because we are selling and exporting and leveraging and distributing things all over. So it's like very important as a country that we figured this out. Right? Yeah. That we're not a ethnocentric or monolithic.
Well, and then stack on top of it, from my perspective, as all the conversations I'm in around artificial intelligence and everything that's going on with that, the water is getting so muddy in terms of, well, what does it actually mean to be distinctly human, and what is AI capable of doing versus where do we really need to put people in the mix? It's just adding yet another layer of complexity to this. We have to figure this out, or we're going to end up making really bad decisions with really serious consequences.
And the idea of figuring this out, I would assert, is something that requires leadership, right? Whatever, independent of what that answer is, right? Like, what's the line between human and AI, and what's the ethics behind this, and how do we code this, and what data are we collecting, et cetera, I have a colleague who's an executive at a household name company, C-suite, right? Notice I said executive. This person is also a leader, but that's distinct from them having an executive role.
They've earned both the
correct
executive badge and carry with them the leadership qualities that make them a leader.
Completely. And this person was in an executive meeting last week where they were looking at badge data by department down to the individual's name to assess compliance with the hybrid work return to office policy.
Okay.
That the CFO
really good use of their time, it sounds like.
Well, the CFO had pulled it. And so this person, brought up in the conversation, hey, I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we've even pulled that data, or that we're having this conversation, especially at this level, right?
Yeah.
And so when others were trying to control, again, that force, like step up and lead, they were like, I want to drill down to the individual name so I can have a conversation. And if they don't get with the program, they're going to be in here 5 days a week. And that was one of the comments, right? And using force or control typically is sort of inversely correlated with leadership, right? Like leaders don't use force or control, they use influence, right?
Yep.
And that's people want to do a thing versus have to do a thing. And look, authority is an important thing in an organization. If everyone can go sign $1 million contract, that's a problem, right?
That's dangerous,
right? If everyone can fire somebody, I look at you, I don't like you to me, you're fired, right? it's important that authority is defined, right? And that's a managerial practice. Now, how we use the authority can involve leadership, because you might say, oh, we're going to do this thing, or we're going to raise our prices on this, whatever. And then you haven't figured out that, oh, this is, a lot of our customers are on the brink of like poverty. And if we raise our prices, like what impact does that have on them? That's where the ethics and the leadership piece, and that's part of the guts and even the heart that comes into it. But I think one of the challenges is when we collapse leadership as a role, then we say, oh, we're going to do leadership development, right? We're going to do training or executive education, coaching, mentoring.
And we try and lump everything together.
And then we say, oh, who's that for? Oh, it's for 5% of our headcount, because 20% of our headcount are managers. And of that, we got 5%. So, 5 and 15, 20% total supervised people, 5% are executives, 15% are managers of managers or managers. And we're going to stratify, and the people that go to the Institute or the Offsite or the Harvard Business School or Kellogg or something else,
right,
they're going to be this part and this. And then you've got 80% of other people that I guess are like the serfs, and they're just sort of waiting to be told and controlled and manipulated. And it's ridiculous. And especially when I talk like knowledge worker sort of environments or salaried environments, different context, construction site or distribution center, you might need different things. I realize, hospitality, right?
Yeah. And what I'm chuckling at was when you said serfs, I just had a Monty Python reference come back into my head. So, right. Because in some ways it's funny and not funny, because in some ways it's easy to joke about it, but in some ways it's like, but sadly, this is kind of
it's dark humor. It's a dark reference.
It's dark humor because this is the reality we're on. One thing that I wanted to point out, call attention to, that I completely agree with you, because sometimes what happens is you see some of this stuff go south, and there is this almost movement to deconstruct, burn the house down type of a thing. And going back to it, authority isn't bad, like you said. I don't remember where I came across this, but they had done this study, and what they found was in schools, if they took out fences, kids did not like to go play on the playgrounds because it was terrifying. They didn't feel safe. They didn't feel like they were in a safe environment. And so they tended to cluster together at the center, and they didn't really go do anything. But when you put fences up, then it was a healthy thing. Kids went out and they played and whatever, because they felt like, okay, I know where the guardrails are and I now feel comfortable in this environment type of a thing. But I think sometimes what can happen is the fences have turned into barbed wire turrets type of a thing. And it's like, okay. And then we look at that and go, you know what we need? No fences. Let's tear the fences down, not realizing, okay, we've swung the pendulum too far.
Yeah. They look like cages that someone's exercising in prison, right? They have a roof on them. And that's beyond that. That's unnecessary, right? In the right, it's all contextual. But to your point, then it's like this either or. Should we have fences or should we blow up the fences? And people need constraints. They need boundaries. They need principles. They need structure, right? Otherwise, we have anarchy,
chaos.
And then you've got there was stories of Google, right? In its early days, or Google, fantastic company, we use a lot of their products, great brand, good corporate citizen, but early days they were startup, and then they started to grow, and they got to this stage where they were fairly a large business, but they didn't want to put in the structures around approvals and authority. And it became a very toxic, nasty place to work for a period of time. This was and a lot of people churned because it was all about politics and power grabs and this stuff, because it was anarchy. And so everyone was sort of like trying to like stake their claim and do their thing. And once they added more structure, it became a much better place to work, and their financial results were a lot better. But that was the resisting. And this often happens with growth companies, right? What makes you successful at one phase can make you unsuccessful at another phase.
What got you here won't get you there.
Correct. So the propelling force of limited structure and authority let them innovate quickly and be a first mover and test all and experiment. But then that was the thing that was holding them back from geographic expansion, acquisitions, corporate and enterprise sales, all those things. And so I think part of the reason that management has a bad brand, right, is we have this negative association because we don't like to be controlled.
Yeah.
We think of literally one of the most negative things I ever hear in an exit interview is micromanagement. Even in an employment interview, tell me about your best boss and your worst boss. Those are questions I typically ask. And almost always they say, I was micromanaged. So the idea of management is like associate, we put this qualifier, it's micromanaged, but it sucks.
Well, and you'll see this. What's interesting is there are good reasons why people have the visceral reaction to it that they do. Because again, going back to what we said, there's a difference between management and executive roles and then leaders. And everybody's been under that person who was in the position but was not a leader. And it's not a great experience. So I understand where some of that brand comes in, but also some of it's also just human nature in some regards. Like I've been in plenty of situations. I've got 7 kids. Like there are plenty of times where they're perfectly happy. But if I were to try and do anything that even is perceived as control, set a boundary even for their own, suddenly it's the end of the world type of a thing. And it's like nothing changed. What are you talking? Why are you melting down right now? Oh, you're trying to tell me what to. It's like, what? Like, no, I'm not doing any of that. And so I do think that is one of the challenges with this is that you can overcorrect, but you can almost go, boy, I just don't even want to go there because people do just have a reaction to the idea of somebody telling them what to do.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally it's about control, right?
Yes.
And, as humans, we do really well. I mean, you as a parent certainly know if you don't create structure for kids, it ain't good for the kid. It ain't good for the parents. It ain't good for the family, the community. It ain't right. So
it's not good for anybody.
Sleep schedules, school, regularity, rituals, when we put shoes on and off, like there's really important things. When we, where we stop running in the grass, we don't run into the street, right? Important things.
Don't touch that thing. It's hot.
Yeah. Like very important fundamental things. And so, but, we never talk about macro management or micro leadership. I was micro led. like it's this thing. And yet, I often will challenge from a coaching perspective. I'm like, well, you may have been micromanaged because you needed to be, right? You may have been like we assume that the boss is a jerk, right? Or has some, but it's like, well, if you don't stay in communication and don't manage up and don't close the loop and don't communicate, you're probably, you're going to get as much supervision as you need. And so
anybody who's been in a people management role can relate to this. Totally. If you've had that person who is not meeting expectations and you're trying to well-intended set clear expectations, follow up, hold them accountable to the things they do. And they're fighting against it going, you're micromanaging me. And it's like, well, in a way, yes, because I have to, and you're putting me in that position.
Correct. But then they're going to, project onto the manager that they're a controlling jerk, when in reality, the manager is trying to the achievement of results through other. They are trying to achieve results, and they are sort of getting someone in line to do that. And so there's one of my colleagues and friends, Justin Kerr, wrote a book, How to Write an Email, which is not about emails, but it's about upward management. And he was the chief merchandising officer at Levi's and Uniqlo and Gap, very successful guy. And he talks about this idea of efficiency through over communication. And that part of what he coaches employees on, right, is always pushing status, keeping people in the loop. Because when a manager has to come to an employee for a thing like a status update, right, or to see the work process, or
it's already too late.
It's too late, and the employee's like, "Get off my lawn!" Right? They're like, it has this like, "Stop trying to control me." Sort of, I'm being micromanaged. You don't trust me. There's all of this reaction, no different than your kids, right?
Yep.
But the manager, she or he or they need to know the status of the work. They are accountable. They are responsible. They're going to be held to account for your work or
they're the one in the meeting that's getting lit up, which is why they're coming and asking in the first place.
And they are literally paying for you to be on their team, not someone else, right? They have chosen you or inherited you or some have you. And there's an expectation that for your compensation, certain things are going to be done, which is defined by your job requirements and goals, et cetera. So there's something very functional about this, but what we don't coach and train employees on is that managing up, is that thing to say, either way, you and your supervisor are going to have to be in sync. So either they can piss in your Cheerios and get on your lawn and you can be upset about it, or you can actively share with them to the point where they cry uncle and say, you're good, we're in sync, that's enough, go.
Right, you can cut back, which goes back to what you had brought up going to the equity conversation. What we are describing right there is a leadership skill.
Correct.
That is a leadership skill. Now, would you apply it differently as an individual contributor than you would as a people manager? Maybe. But the skill is exactly the same. The communicating this stuff, that's what a good people manager does to their boss. So their boss isn't coming to them asking these questions.
Correct.
It's the same set of skills across the board.
And I think that, if you think of the individual contributor and the manager relationship, they're taking some ownership and leading the relationship, right? They don't like, we think of leadership so dimensional, like, oh, do I have control over people in a direct, solid line manner? But no, you can lead movements, you can lead conversations, you can lead alliances, partnerships, idea, like whatever it may be. So what we talk about a lot with Pilot is helping employees meet the manager halfway. We're not trying to let managers off the hook of what they needed to do.
No, because there is a level of accountability. If you're in a people management role, I feel like that is something. And again, a lot of times this is not clearly defined in organizations, which I think is the unfortunate part. Is it's not clearly defined. People get put in a people management role, and expectations are about as vague as they can be. And it's like, just, lead. Yeah. Which doesn't help.
No, not at all. And so I think if I am all for holding people managers to a high standard, including equipping them, supporting them, enabling, providing clarity, defining those things. But 99% of HR's brain and resources and time is like, how do we make our managers better? We got to fix our people. So we got to develop, which, like, I agree a lot should go in there, but we're completely neglecting the employee side, right? 4 out of 5 people in an organization are individual contributors. And we are not saying to them, hey, can you carry some of the water here? Hey, could you maybe make sure that the one-on-ones are on the calendar for your manager? Hey,
and if they're not, go ahead and schedule them.
Go ahead and schedule it. Like, work with the assistant, use Outlook, use whatever it may be. By the way, could you maybe bring an agenda so the manager that's coming from their last meeting that's chaotic doesn't just use this as a therapy session to dump and process on you and you like survive it? Hey, could you advocate for the things you need? Could you put the request? You want more feedback? Can we put that on the agenda where we have time and space and you can say, hey, I'd love some feedback on that deck? Like, that's the part that I think is the unlock of people leading their own lives and their own careers, which isn't a power grab, right?
No.
We have a deficit of leadership in almost every context in the world. Think climate change.
Well, and I think this goes back to what this goes back to is when we say, I agree, there is a leadership skills crisis in every organization. But what I don't agree with, and this is the part that we're talking about now, is I don't agree that that's limited to a certain set of roles in the organization, to your point of the 15%. No, we have existential leadership skill crises across the organization. And so often the way we're trying to solve it is by putting all of that, to your point, on the 15%, going, okay, you really got to carry all this, which I read a recent report on manager burnout, and it's highest it's ever been.
Totally. And you think about, even from the United States perspective, like democracy and how we're structured as a country, we have shared the authority in our federalist model, right? The federal government versus the states then have counties, the counties then have cities and townships and hamlets and villages and all the things, right? So we're not assuming one monolithic authoritarian, right? When we say authoritarianism, everyone's like, oh, that's horrible, that's bad, right? But definitionally, like denotatively, it's the consolidation of power into a very small subset. And in some ways, we almost think of leadership as in a sort of authoritarian structure, right? That a very select few can do the thing and should be anointed and should know how. But that's sort of antithetical to our values as a country and our system of, democracy and freedom and government and all these things, which there's a lot of difference in America. But I think that's one of the things that we share and have in common. And so part of it is like leaning into this idea of we have to not only share some of that, and it's less about like the sharing authority, right? Because it's not like people are like, oh, they don't want to give up control.
It's not about power.
No,
That's the thing. It's not about power.
It
shouldn't be. That's, I think, where it goes south, is when it becomes about power. Then we've got a problem on our hands.
Nobody wants to give up power or control, right?
Yep.
But if we expand the pie or broaden the tent or whatever analogy that you want to use, there is a massive opportunity for people to step up and lead. And we're often very inspired when we see people in our community, the person that creates the book lending library on the end of your corner, and it's the little, birdhouse looking thing where you put books in and out, someone had like, no one anointed that person with control. So you were they were like, you know what, this would be sweet. This would be sweet.
You're the neighborhood library person.
Yeah. Like, but they did it. And then everybody benefits because they took up some ownership, right? Yeah. They initiated, they did something. They didn't have a title. The governor didn't send them on a mission, like they're not a political appointee, right?
The mayor didn't show. We could play this out all day, but I'm just picturing these comical things because instinctively we know this, yet we continue having some of these expectations. Because that person, to your point, they weren't sitting on their doorstep and then all of a sudden the mayor drove to their house and said, you know what we need? We need a library on the corner and you're the person to do it. So now you go, and they're like, well, I wasn't planning on it. I didn't want to, but I guess now I've been dawned with that responsibility.
Yes, sir. Right. And it's like, it's not that. And so I think one of my big calls to arms for HR is to broaden leadership development. Now, part of the reason leadership development is sort of structurally exclusive is we haven't figured out ways to distribute it. Like leadership, the average leadership development program often requires days or weeks or even sometimes months out of work. I talked to a colleague who, is the CEO of a utility company and one of our customers, and he went to a program at Stanford University. And I think he said it was 7 or 8 weeks he was out of the office, like literally out of office, like not working, taking calls. And it was like $80,000, right? So that's an extreme example, right?
That's an extreme example, but I think anybody listening or watching this knows, especially we're talking to HR talent people, they know that a lot of times the programs that are put together for leadership development, they're not scalable. They're not designed to be accessible by the vast majority of people. And quite frankly, even the people who it is accessible to, technically, it's not convenient or fitting into a lot of what they're trying to do at all.
No. And so you've got these programs that maybe a more, common example is a week-long program, right? That people fly into Houston or St. Louis or Chicago or DC or wherever your headquarters is or executive education, but they plane ticket, they're out of work for 5 days. There's the cost of the program. So listen, you're kind of looking like a $10,000 to $20,000 price tag, right? For something like that, like all in, right? Because you think travel alone's a couple $1,000, right? So, and then they're out of work. You can't, if you're to say, oh, let's do that for all 5,000 employees at this organization, they're like, wait, $15,000 times 5, like, you're like, oh my gosh, this, like, no way, right? So
we'd have to shut down the operations for a week. We can't.
Like let's take a hit to earnings. Let's put a special item in our guidance.
We'll just go to our shareholders and say, we decided we are going to spend a week with all our employees, and no, it's not going to happen.
So I think that part of democratizing leadership development, which includes different methods, like we talk about democratizing coaching or mentoring or different training, if you separate the method to do that, because there's a number of ways to kind of skin that cat. You just say, like, the idea of like sort of empowering people to see themselves as leaders and to understand their leadership expression and style, and to have these things. We have to figure out a way to, one, make it more affordable. So it's just like the cost per person. That's the metric, like per participant cost. And two, make it more inclusive. And that includes structural, like it could be virtual, it's flexible, it takes less total hours. Because you're just like people when you're an EVP, you have an executive assistant who can block your calendar for a week, and you have a deputy and a chief of staff and all these things. When you're, the accounts payable.
I was just talking about this with my wife last night.
You can't protect your calendar, your time, right? Yeah. What were you saying to your wife?
No, I was just talking about how this is a huge issue in organizations, because oftentimes the decisions being made about how we should develop our leaders are being made by people who have the luxury of some of those capabilities and go, well, this makes sense, but really to the frontline people manager, or the everyday person, the individual contributor who just truly needs to build leadership skills, they don't have that luxury. They do not have the ability to go, oh, yeah, you know what? Move all my meetings next week. I'm going to spend the week in leadership development. They just do not have the ability to do that.
And if we take that a step further, based on sort of a diversity and inclusion perspective, they may be in a multi-generational household at home. They may
That's
have
what I'm saying.
elder or dependent care. They may not have an au pair or a nanny or a spouse that's a stay-at-home spouse, because they're double income household, right? So the idea of them traveling for the week.
No, I mean, I'm hypersensitive to this situation because, again, with 7 kids, but I also have a personal situation that makes it near impossible for me to go places. So I can relate to this, where when we do these things, we don't realize the burden we're actually putting on people when we go, hey, congratulations, you've made it. We're sending you to leadership development. And it feels more like a prison sentence than it does a reward, because
I have to figure that out with my wife and my 7 kids and manage my medical thing and do this and my community, whatever, and my faith obligation or my whatever it may be. And so I think, and it's not that I'm anti-travel or in-person programs.
No,
I think we have to have a spectrum in options, right? Because typically in my experience, I see sort of an inverse correlation with people who are high performers and the amount of talent and leadership development they do, because your top salesperson is less likely to be in a leadership program, because they're out there on sales calls making either your finance, your product, your M&A person, whatever it might be, your HR person. So we have to find ways to make these programs more inclusive. And I don't just mean in like the softer side of inclusive. I mean structurally inclusive, which is less time commitment, more flexible and asynchronous, more virtual, right?
Well, and what's funny about this is I talk a lot about, I have a bit of a brand around the tech. I talk a lot about this stuff. And a lot of times it's perceived that that's a personal bias and a personal preference for things. And I'll be the first to acknowledge, there are certainly personal attributes of that are true. But part of my fight for this has been about inclusivity on all of these things, because when you actually look at the masses of employees who desperately need this stuff, and the data and the reports are overwhelming. Like, if you don't believe it, just go read any recent report by one of the consulting companies on the state of employees. They desperately need it. And yet what's being offered to them is often completely inaccessible to a large percentage of them. And it's just like, well, that's the cost of doing business. Or if it's really that important to you, make it a priority. And it's like, that is one of the most tone deaf and insensitive things that you can put out there to your population.
One of our customers, MetLife, sells their group benefits business, sells to benefits managers. Benefits managers in the United States are now 85% female. And their customer and client entertainment used to be after-hour stuff, football games and concerts and steakhouses and all these things. They did some research because they got some females in leadership that have more empathy and EQ and all these things. And they said, you know what? Turns out that, rather just like your leader, I'm being sent to leadership development in Dallas. Is that a bug or is that a feature? Well, for you, it might be a bug, right? These folks are saying, MetLife is going to entertain me. Like my carrier is going to entertain
box
me.
Seats at the whatever game next week.
They're like, one, I don't even like sports maybe, or 2, that's going to jack up my whole life structure. So what we started to do, and they partnered with us on this, is that what they wanted to do is actually advance their careers and take care of themselves. So we started to do leadership development and career development luncheons and breakfasts. And what we did is they said, look, I don't want to be in a sticky, dark place. I don't want to be at a place that feels unsafe. I don't want to be in this or that. I don't want to be out at night. All these said, let's do it at lunch or at breakfast. We went to Lux restaurants, Lux hotels, we did it up really nicely. And we made it this really great celebratory, community thing. It was an in-person experience. We've done some virtual ones too. Interestingly enough, the satisfaction on the virtual ones was even higher, to their surprise. But, and the attendance was higher because more people could make it, right? And people even said,
it was more inclusive.
I have this thing. Yeah, my kid is like the school is canceled because of snow, but I can still make this thing because my kid's like watching, a movie right now while I'm on this thing. So that's the part that I think we have to have a little bit more ingenuity around.
We do.
Because, there's just this like classroom versus online. Well, like online we associate with like e-learning module, which online can mean so many different things now.
Well, and again, going back to it, I understand where people's response to that is, because I said this on a call the other day. Most people's experience with online learning has sucked.
Yeah,
I mean, it's not been great. So I get it when people go, ooh, like that's the alternative. So I get it. But to your point, there is high quality, like you can do it well. But the thing that you said that I think really jumped out on this, and now I completely forgot what it was. And it was
the
a really
boomerang
good
will
one
swoop
too.
around.
Keep
I'm
going.
certain that
Yeah.
you know, but the inventiveness that we have to have and the thoughtfulness as we design these programs is we have to think about, have them take less time for the employee, have them cost less money for the organization, have them be more flexible to fit in with the flow of work and life, right?
Yeah.
And to not create structural barriers. You know, we have a couple of customers, you know, and they'd be fine with me sharing this, Nestle and Diageo, that their DEI teams are sponsoring talent and L&D and leadership things. So it used to be, right, all that came from the talent or L&D. Now DEI is investing in these things because of some of the structural challenges. They've created ways for people that, some organizations use our leadership development program pilot, and they'll say people have to be a level 6 and above, or they have to be manager nominated, or they have to be a hypo, or they have to be a performance.
Right. We got this whole list of criteria before anybody can get in.
Yeah, which can be functional and thoughtful, and it's a way to like
work.
focus and, you know, data driven. But they decided to experiment, right? And this is where we've got some very courageous and innovative leaders, not because of their role, but because of their behaviors and their mindset, at Diageo and at Nestle and some of our other organizations we work with, that said, what if we did some of these programs that people could just opt in? They could nominate themselves. Like, and they could be back office. They could be there for 1 year of tenure. They could be a level 12, you know, at the, you know, or if it's further down the hierarchy. And as long as they were not on a PIP, that was the only constraint, that they could be an average performer. They could be individual. And what we found is the participation and impact of the folks that opted in was even higher. We're getting insane results out of the folks that were nominated, and we have great change management around, like, getting excited. But to our surprise and theirs, there's an even higher, because people are like, it's parched earth, right? You think about, I mean, I watered my plants. I'm a green thumb. I got green stuff all over my apartment. You know, there's one of my plants, I water it, and I can see in like 15 minutes, it starts to grow.
It just sucks.
Like, and I can literally start to see, and it's this incredible, you know, plant that I have. And that plant is emblematic of a lot of folks that are in that 80% of individual contributors, or they're at the lower strata, the 20% of managers that are essentially never able to be in the leadership club, to sit in first class.
Because they haven't been tapped with the scepter. Correct. Or what's been available has been completely inaccessible to them.
Correct. And then when you give them something that they can include themselves in, that's accessible, that they can fit into their life, and you design it in a way where you edit down to the critical few with empathy and respect for their time, and there's connection and is meaningful, and it doesn't feel like charity for the organization or an obligation like compliance training. It feels like, holy crap, this is an investment in me. And wow, I am more effective, not just at work, but in my life, right? You develop the leader within, you know, that accounts payable lead, or that field marketing rep, or that, you know, HR benefits administrator, or whomever it may be, that wouldn't be on the big leadership bench succession planning document, right? Or chart or 9-box. They are still valuable to your organization to keep retained, to keep engaged, to keep productive, they take care of a lot of important things, your data, quality, customers, resources, the treatment of others. And so that investment mindset, we have to be thinking like 2 generations ahead. And this isn't about AI, and this isn't about a bunch of other crap or trends, right?
But again, to your point, a lot of times this is this short-term thinking. I mean, there's the thing with it is when you, and I'm sure you've done it because of all the work that you've done, but when you start unpacking this, there's a whole lot that goes into why some of these things are the way they are. And it doesn't make it okay.
No,
but it's one of those like, okay, but what are we going to do about it? Because I get, okay, well, maybe that's not the way programs are designed now. All right, well, then let's figure that out. Like, let's solve for that. Well, We have to segregate, different groups because we know different groups work differently with each other. Okay, well, I think to your point, opening it up to the masses doesn't mean that you never have, well, this is specifically for this group of managers to work together, because some of the challenges they're solving are unique. Yeah,
Right.
you can still do that. I think some of the pushback that I've seen to some of these things is usually easily solved for.
Totally. And if you back out of a single solution or a single way of doing it, right, there's always many roads to Rome, right? So
Yep.
There's nothing more dangerous in the world with a person with only one idea that they're in love with, right?
Yep.
So you back up, you say, well, what else would you, and again, like Nestle, Diageo, other groups that we work with have done this blended approach. Well, yes, we have certain programs we target towards ERG leaders and certain programs we target towards certain manager development programs, but we also have this option. So that what they've done is they've even used the same program and they've distributed it or deployed it differently.
Yeah.
Right?
Again, you're building once, deploying in different ways to different audiences for different purposes.
I thought about that with like how we did COVID vaccine distribution. How you do it in a nursing home is different than how you do it on a college campus, is different than how you do it for office workers, which is also different than how you do it for the homeless, right? And so there were different things. We did in New York City, they did the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It was the one shot. They did it on the subway platform because they knew people that were frontline workers, didn't have time to make an appointment, go to a doctor's office, and they weren't going to come back for a second shot either. So it's important that they only used the vaccine that required one shot, and they did it literally on the platform. And I think that they had 70,000 people, 70,000 got the vaccine on the subway platform. But that's distribution, that's empathy, that's like meeting people where they are, rather than be like, oh no, go to your primary care physician, which you don't have, with the insurance that you don't have, and with the documentation about your immigration status.
And take time off, right? Yeah, and take time off work to go do all this, right? All these other
things, and do it in the language which you don't speak, right? That's where I think we have to take this monolithic thing of like our employees, right? And you have to, marketers would personify and segment and all these things to understand that different groups may need different things. And so I think,
well, and what's interesting about what you said with that, and I think this is where there's value in people thinking more complexly and nuanced about this, because to your point with what you said, I love the point about not thinking about our employees as this monolithic, the employees.
Totally.
Okay. If you've met one employee, you've met one employee. Like, even if they're in the same job function, job title, report to the same manager, you've met that person, and their situation and their skill set and what they bring to the table and their story is completely different than the one sitting right next to them in your mind doing the exact same job as they are. It's just that diverse, which sometimes can lead people to go, oh, that's just too complicated. We can't do anything with it. But that's not true, because at the end of the day, even going back to what we said, leadership development is the same skills for every single person in your organization. These are not, going back to the competencies. Nobody looks at this and go, wow, these models are just all over the map. But how you apply it, the conversations you may have, the way you may implement it may look a little bit different, but there's the consistency underneath it. And that's the part where you can do this at scale.
And to add to that, our push is have the employee personalize and individualize it, because they know the most about their goals, their learned experiences of life, their values, their aspirations. Not all employees want to move vertically up in the organization. Not all employees,
and that's okay,
want to be people supervisors. Not all employees. And so to your point, you may have 3 sales reps that all have the same title, or 3 HR business partners, all the same title. But the iceberg principle around that of like, one has kids and one doesn't, right? One's further along in the career, one's an immigrant and sends money home to their home country, and one doesn't. Like, super different icebergs on, one has 7 kids and one, like, that's what we have to, and then let the employees say, hey, we're going to standardize and have consistency in how we define leadership and how we think about that. But you're going to apply it and leverage it, bringing in the context for you. And that's what we do with Pilot and with coaching, is people bring in and say, okay, well, like, if I'm not looking for a promotion, how I'm going to apply my leadership skills is going to be different. I might be looking for more well-being and boundaries so I can be with my family or practice my faith or take care of my health or whatever it might be. And so
Yeah.
that's where I think we often think that like HR has to figure that out. And my point is, if we have adults, HR has to support people in figuring it out for themselves. So it's not just you're on your own and good luck, Johnny, go light a fire in the woods.
Yeah, you own your own career type of a thing.
Like it's not just like tough shit, go do it, but it's to say, hey, like we believe in you. We're going to provide you some resources and support. We're going to work on the organization to be ready for you to advocate for yourself and to speak up and solicit feedback and state your aspirations. But you also have to figure out what the heck that is for you. And then you have to initiate leads because you have the biggest whiffum. The what's in it for me is you getting your needs met. And so I think that's the conversation that we tend to just think we have to control it all from on top.
And I don't think this just ties to leadership development. I mean, I think you would agree with that. And I see this all the time in organizations where organizations are going through massive changes, or they're going through this or that, or they're trying to figure this out. And there's this mentality of like, we got to get the right people in the room so we can hammer it all out and figure out every single detail for folks. And then we'll just let them know what that is. And it's actually far more empowering and effective when you go, what are the things that we need consistency in? Let's get the right people in the room to do that. Going back to your point early in the conversation that authority is not bad. It's not bad to have a group of people going, hey, these are the non-negotiables of what we're trying to accomplish here. We need to nail that down. Like, perfect, fine. But then from there, actually going back, and the number of times I've seen this in organizations where you go to people and go, here are the non-negotiables, but you and your leader and the people around you know better than anyone else what it looks like to bring this to life. And we're going to actually give you the autonomy to figure that out. There will be accountability that these things are accomplished. Absolutely. Because I think that's where you see the other argument. Well, we can't just let people do things and that they won't do it. You can hold them accountable, but hold them accountable to the outcome, not the activity. Not the, well, you have to do it this way.
Correct. And, you know, you got 7 kids. I bet they have different learning modalities and styles. Like how they get their homework done might look different, right? Someone wants to do it in the kitchen when it's a bunch of chaos around. Someone else needs to have headphones on and be quiet. Like someone else needs to do it with someone else.
So and I don't gather them into a room and go, you're all going to sit down and you're going to do it exactly like Daddy said. That's the way I like it and I'm comfortable with. And so you need to do it this way. And if you're not, then in my mind, you're not doing it right.
Correct. Instead, it's like, hey, the outcome is you need to do your homework.
Right. And you need to get these grades.
Yep.
I need to see this. I need to see this effectiveness. And I need to see these things.
But if you
have the flexibility and autonomy to figure that out.
If you're a kinesthetic learner, you know, you need to kind of physically be moving.
Oh, don't go into the learning styles. You're going to set the audience off.
You know, so you're going to, you know, so like that's, you know, whatever it means. And so I think that what we're talking about is sort of like that freedom within a framework, right? We're saying, hey, like, this is the expectations and some of the standards, but I think we have to, you know, if we don't trust, if we think people in the field of an organization are idiots, right? We have a bigger problem, right?
We have a exactly. That's just it. It's like, if you truly can't trust your people and think they're morons, and if you didn't tell them exactly what to do, they just,
how are they going to take care of
watch Netflix all day? You got bigger issues on your hand.
So I think that, but you have to be a high context communicator, offer sort of thick explanations about the what and the why, and let them figure out more of the how, right? Because you're saying, hey, what is leadership? We're defining it as these things. Why do we need this? Here's how it ties to our strategy and our performance and our work environment and our values. How do you do this in Japan versus in Boise, Idaho? Might look a little different, right? And that is okay.
That's okay.
And so I think that that's a part of, but that's releasing some of the control without necessarily negotiating down the standard or the expectation, which we collapse those, right? And I think that, and I think that's where I think HR tends to play really small often, is because what HR will do is they will be the sheriff or mayor of a small town, right? They will control the crap out of some tiny little thing and have it be completely standardized, one size fits none. And they will scale that thing and then do that. And then that's it, rather than a much bigger movement. You know, if anyone has done grassroots activism, coalition stuff, you have to tolerate a little messiness, a little.
Yeah, you have to.
Right. Like people having their own thing. And that's the emotional part for, I think, HR talent and DI leaders and in business and senior executives.
And letting go.
And I said later, do you see what I just did there? leaders. Like, so it could be
It's hard. You caught me on it earlier because it comes out.
But you know, people in positions of
Yes.
authority in management is to, you know, set clear and high standards and create frameworks and guardrails, enablement and resources, and also tolerate and embrace adaptation, experimentation, innovation in all of that, which means it's going to be a little bit messy. And when you got two or more people doing anything in life, it's going to be a little bit messy unless you're going to be authoritarian and bash the humanity out of people, in which case you're going to get at best submission and compliance, which doesn't create great workplaces or employees or engagement or leadership. You just get submission.
Yep. And going back to it, and then we can wrap, even though we didn't even get into it, because I really think the coachability piece is an important part. But going back to it, what we're talking about doesn't mean releasing accountability.
No.
Like that's the response a lot of times you see is, well, but then it's not going to get done. And it's about helping people see, no, that's not it. You are still holding people accountable. There is still going to be coaching. There's still going to be developing. There's still going to be redirecting that happens among there. It's about doing it to the right things instead of, I liked your HR analogy, instead of controlling these very tiny things perfectly, going, but what if we could control the whole thing, but in a way that it was more influential? We influence the whole thing, but be okay with some of the nuance.
And you don't have to always have the answer. You can say, hey, I get that you want to adapt it this way, but I need to know if it was effective in the way that I would typically do it. We'd measure these ways. And if you do it this way, we won't be able to measure it that way. So how can we,
how are you going to account for that?
And then you're in this thing where it's like, okay, I still get my need met of assessing efficacy, but I'm not forcing you into my model of doing the thing, because you don't have to negotiate on, I need to know if something's effective. That is a completely legitimate
that is a completely reasonable expectation. If we're going to do this, it needs to be effective.
But it may be validated differently, right? Based upon the context. And so that's a negotiation in an act of creativity, right? Because you may learn the way that they figure out how to evaluate efficacy is actually better than you were. And you may port some of those insights to your standard way. And so I think that's the part where, again, it's like this loosening up. Like, leadership is so calcified in our minds and so rigid and you know, reductive. And I think it's like leadership should be set free, should take flight. And so that's what I'm taking away from this conversation.
Well, and I think, and then we'll close, you know, when I think about it, I think of things on the spectrum of three ways. And one, you've got like the tight-fisted, just death grip, and that's not productive. On the other end, you've got the like, well, I guess we'll just kick back and whatever happens, happens. And that's not it. It's that single hand held openly, where it's like, we've put in the guidance, we've done this, but we aren't holding so tightly to it. Because to your point, the number of times where I've thought something, but I've given people the freedom to go, more often than not, they end up surprising me with something I hadn't considered, or an even better way than had crossed my mind. And that's inclusion of diversity of perspective, right? Like, if your ideas are the best ones, you're never going to come up with those. So I hope everyone listening today and is joining, just again, like, let leadership fly, set it free, open up your mind and others, and allow people to meet you halfway. That's the ownership. And that's an engaging work experience. That people talk about the best place they work. It's a place where they're given. That's what people describe. That's what people describe when I asked, what was the greatest leadership environment you worked in? That's exactly what they described. So, Ben, always a pleasure. So happy to have you back again. Hopefully everybody listening and watching has taken at least a handful of things from this to the way they're thinking about developing leaders, and really, who are the leaders in your organization. So thank you so much.
Glad to be here, and would love to connect with anyone on LinkedIn and be a resource in the HR community.
All right. Sounds good. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next week.